Good morning or good evening, everybody, depending where you are in the world. Will still be a couple of people trickling in, but I will get started on some of the introductions for this session. Before I say anything further, I just want to remind you that we are recording this webinar, including the question and answer session. These recordings will then be available on YouTube shortly after the seminar. Anyway, welcome to week 3 of the Youth Mobilities webinar series, which is being hosted by UCL Global, the Centre for Global Youth. My name is Avril Keating, and I'm the co-organizer of this webinar series along with Sazana Jayadeva, who's just joined Cambridge University, and Rachel Benchikroon, who is a doctoral student at the Institute of Education with me. In weeks 1 and 2, which we've done this month, we visited India and then China. But then this week, we're heading to Australia to hear from Shanti Robertson and to learn more about her work on young middle class Asians migrating to Australia. Shanti is an associate professor at Western Sydney University, where her research focuses on migration, diversity, youth studies, and urban social change. She has been awarded several prestigious grants from the Australian Research Council to explore these themes and has published in journals such as Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies and the Journal of Youth Studies. Today, Shanti is going to focus on the findings she discussed in her second book, Temporality in Mobile Lives, Contemporary Asia, Australia, Migration in Everyday Time, which was published by Bristol University Press in January of this year. Congratulations, Shanti. But before I pass over to Shanti, I want just a reminder to pop your questions into the chat along the side. Shanti will talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'll provide sort of a very, very brief, short discussant comments, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers after that. Okay. Thanks again, Shanti, for joining us, and I'm now going to pass over to you.
Hi, everybody. I really want to say thank you to... Oh, I'm frozen. Can you still hear me okay?
We can hear you, Shanti, but if it's easier, you can turn your camera off. Just to explain, 6 p.m., which is the time that it is in Australia, is the busiest time for Zoom use and internet use in Australia. So Shanti may experience some technical difficulties.
Okay, seems to be all right for now, so I'll see how I go. Thank you so much, Avril, Susanna and Rachel, for the invitation to speak at the Global Youth webinar series. It's a really exciting webinar series and I'm really thrilled to be invited. So this presentation is an overview of the key themes, as Avril said, in my recent book, which came out with Bristol University Press in January. The book overall focuses on how transnational mobility reshapes lived experiences of cultural, social and embodied time for young middle class migrants who move from Asia to Australia, seeking educational, career and lifestyle opportunities. We were just talking before the presentation about the awkwardness of self-promotion, and my next slide is really going to, that's my shameless plug for the book. This is actually a special discount code for the ebook that is specifically for this event's attendees. So if you use that before the 25th of May, you get a discount, and you can also get 35% off the hard copy if you sign up for the BUP newsletter, and my publisher will be very happy that I included this slide. It is the year of book talks for me, so I do want to apologise if there are any audience members, for example, a couple of my very lovely PhD students who have probably heard some versions of this material a few times by now. So this is a quote that I'm beginning with from one of the participants of the project, which just foreshadows a lot of what I'm going to be unpacking in this seminar. I'm going to recount her story in a little bit of detail because it's quite typical in a lot of ways of the stories that I heard throughout the research. So this is a young woman called Hyun Woo who grew up in a small town in South Korea. When she secured a place for an engineering degree at a top university in Seoul, her parents were really thrilled. Hyun Woo told me they thought that my future is guaranteed. Hyun Woo, however, was really miserable after she moved to Seoul. She felt like she didn't fit in. Her classmates' desires and imaginations of their future really mirrored the expectations of Hyun Woo's family. As she told me, you follow the mainstream. You have to go to university and then you have to get a job, married at 30, kids before 30 and all that. Hyun Woo was really feeling like she wanted something different, but she wasn't yet sure what that was. She left her engineering course without graduating. Her mother and father were really shocked and quite angry. Hyun Woo thought to herself, in that case, I'm going to go as far away as possible so you can't say anything to me. Coming to Australia was quite a pragmatic decision. A working holiday visa was quite easy to get. The Korean won at the time was quite strong against the Australian dollar. And more importantly, Hyun Woo told me it was really far away from Korea and totally different. She arrived in Melbourne with only very basic competency in English in 2006. She checked into a backpacker hostel and thought she would give it at least 6 months to try and think about what she wanted to do next. By the time I met Hyun Woo, she'd actually been in Melbourne for 9 years, and she'd stayed by transitioning from the working holiday visa to a student visa to do a course in social welfare at TAFE, which is the vocational education system here in Australia. Her parents were once again really appalled. Hyun Woo explained that working in social services didn't have a lot of legitimacy in Korea, especially in the kind of middle-class family she was from. Her parents said to her that she was wasting her brain and sending herself down to the bottom of the list. After a bit of persuasion, however, they agreed that they would pay some of the course fees for TAFE, and Hyun Woo found casual work as a waitress to support her living costs. When she finished her training, she moved on to a temporary graduate visa. You used to have a fairly similar visa category here in the UK several years ago. These visas allow international students to work in Australia between 18 months and 4 years, depending on the level of qualification after their graduation. Like many migrants on these visas, Hyun Woo transitioned through volunteer work, part-time, and eventually full-time work in various parts of her sector, working across social welfare in diverse areas from migrant settlement to child protection. She knew that if she was going to progress her career, she would need Australian permanent residency, which I'll refer to hereafter as PR. And she also thought she might want to return to study, something that she could not do on a graduate visa without again enrolling as an international student and paying those much higher fees. The permanent residency was just a way to give her a few more options, not necessarily a way to settle down permanently. While she waited for her PR application to be processed, she was on a bridging visa. Life kind of went on as normal. She signed up a bit spontaneously to do a scuba diving course at a local dive centre. This soon became a new passion and also a new community. She met her partner, Peter, who she described as a typical white Australian through the diving community. Yet despite the fact that she had a hobby, a community, a relationship, Hyun Woo told me that the 3 years she spent waiting for her permanent residency really dragged, that time went really slowly. She was frustrated because as a temporary migrant on a bridging visa, she was refused many services like a home loan or even a mobile phone contract. As a result of this ongoing sense of insecurity, she had some last-minute doubts, wondering if she should in fact return to Korea. But she continued to wait, more or less committed to a future in Australia, but with this sense of her present as somewhat suspended. In 2013, 3 years after submitting her application and 7 years after she'd first arrived, Hyun Woo received her Australian permanent residency. Quite soon after she left the social services sector, once she'd qualified for PR, she no longer had to remain working in that field for the immigration points. We met up a second time, about a year after we first met. And at that stage, Hyun Woo had really pulled back from full-time work. She was doing a bit of freelance work here and there for a dive company. Her boyfriend was earning a pretty good salary, and she said she was happy to have more time to take long walks with her dog and to go diving. And they plan to move into the country sometime in the next couple of years, hopefully somewhere close to good dive sites. In this interview, Hyun Woo laughingly noted that she's very much a bad daughter. Not only is she unmarried, she's living with a non-Korean partner, not planning on having children, and is certainly not following a full-time and financially lucrative career. But some kernel of that filial daughter remains, however. She went back to Korea for her father's retirement celebrations and also to nurse her mother through cancer in 2011, even though this was at a point in time when her visa application was still pending and could in fact have been jeopardized by leaving Australia. In both the interviews, however, Hyun Woo really moved back and forth, as she does in this quote here on the slide, between describing her experiences as marked by significant freedom to plot her own course into adult life, but also significant constraints. She said the best thing about living in Australia was that you don't have to have a set plan for life, but she also acknowledged she'd had to go through quite a few challenges in order to get where she was. So I just wanted to start with that kind of extended vignette from the fieldwork, because it's really emblematic of the book's key concerns, how migration conditions, particularly unfortunately, these insecure, time-bound and staggered visa pathways radically impact young people's quite intimate understandings of and relationships to time, both their past and their futures, but also to everyday and embodied temporalities. So a very quick little amount of background on the project. I've just got an overview of approach and methods on the slide. I'd say two really critical things that I wanted to note for this paper in particular. What's significant about this group is that age or life stage that I guess many sociologists think about in terms of transition to adulthood. So they were all aged between 16 and 30 when they arrived. And second, what I refer to as staggered pathways. So these transitions across various temporary visas. Those are two things really significant to the experiences I'll describe in the paper. The participants did come from diverse national backgrounds, but they all shared a sense of middle class aspirations and expectations of transnational mobility as conferring particular kinds of cultural capital. They also very much share a consciousness of the normative framing of their life stage as one where they're supposed to be working on accumulating the markers of middle-class adulthood, stable careers, homes, marriages, even if in many cases, mobility was a way to resist or reshape some of these norms. And I do want to draw a little bit of attention to the project website where I've got some visualizations, which was one of my methods for outputs for the project. And it can be quite good, I think, to go and pop on the website while you're listening and have a look and a click through at some of those visualizations of journeys of participants. So a little bit of the conceptual background to the book. To sort of uncover some of that complexity of temporality in these young people's lives, I draw on the concept of chronomobilities. It's a big word, but it's just used, I just use it to really empirically describe the temporalities that structure mobile lives, as well as the temporalities that actually emerge from mobile lives. And I draw here on ideas of time regimes, the temporal conditions of governance, and the wider sociotemporal orders that underpin these mobilities. And then time logics, which is the way individuals narrate and make meaning of their lived experiences of time. So it's quite a sociological approach. I won't spend a lot of time explaining the time logics now, these lived experiences of synchronicity, tempo and sequencing and how they're impacted by mobility, because I think it will become really apparent what I'm talking about in my analysis of the data later in the paper, at least I hope so. There is a growing body of literature many of you would be aware of on migration and temporality. I won't critique it in detail today, but I'll say in general that a lot of the focus and studies of time and migration has tended to be on time as a form of discipline and its material and effective impacts on highly precarious migrant, undocumented migrant workers or refugees. So there's a slightly different empirical focus, I guess, in my book within that sort of general temporal turn. So it's a particular look at the life stage of emerging adulthood for mobile and middle class young Asians. So this is kind of the policy context, but also really a way to sort of think through one of these time regimes that's significant to this work. And that's what I refer to as translocation of migration, a constellation of changes to both policy and cultural framings of migration in Australia in the 21st century. It's a move away from the settler paradigms of the 20th century and away from linear understandings of the temporality of migration as this progression from arrival to settlement and belonging. So by using this idea of translocation, I'm suggesting that migration in the 21st century in Australia is simultaneously constructed as transient. So that is of limited and contingent duration, transitory, a stage in an ongoing pathway of mobility rather than a destination or an endpoint of arrival, and transitionary, a process that involves multiple overlapping and non-sequential changes of status, identity, and belonging. And this paradigm is evident in Australia through a number of key changes in the 21st century, three which I'll highlight here. First, temporary visas, again, pre-COVID, that's the caveat of this whole study. Temporary visas have become more accessible and increasingly prevalent in comparison to permanent visas. Second, migrants increasingly, like Hyun Woo did, experience this transition across different legal categories. And of course, also across scholarly typologies of migrant mobility. So moving between skilled and unskilled work, being a student, being a worker, a labour migrant, or a lifestyle migrant. And third, migration itself, again, many of you are writing on this, has become desequentialized, non-linear, and an often unfinished life project involving these varied stages, durations, and multi-directional trajectories. So it's not just that temporary migration has increased a lot in Australia, but it's that these transitions between temporary categories and between temporariness and permanence have become the norm. And it is young, middle class and educated Asian migrants who are particularly prominent within these new patterns of temporally heterogeneous mobility. Most people that go through the staggered pathways arrive on either a student visa or a working holiday visa as their first entry point. Okay, so I'm getting onto the data now after that rather hefty intro. I'm going to just try and look at 4 themes across 2 of the book's empirical chapters. There is a 3rd chapter on the relationships between place attachment and time, but have to save that for another day. So I want to start with this idea of the indenture of the present. And what I describe in this section as the indenture of the present, it's referring to these very specific durations of time, particularly in relation to work, where migrants remain suspended or contained and unable to move out or forward. And often this is a suspension that's required to obtain a migration outcome or to further a particular career goal. Of course, the term indenture is quite provocative. It does evoke a colonial history of Asian migrant worker mobilities throughout the Asia Pacific, including to Australia. So not using it to imply that these more middling experiences are at all commensurate with those colonial era oppressions. But I just want to mobilise that idea of indenture to sort of evoke how the conditions of transnational mobility actually end up structuring durations of immobility and containment, even for these quite privileged migrants, and how, particularly in relation to their careers, this containment is often understood by migrants themselves via a particular sequential imaginary involving the temporary sacrificing, or what Bastiat and McGrath have referred to as the mortgaging of the present for the future. So this is a quote from Abigail from Malaysia, and her story, I think, highlights not only the career impacts, but also some of these affective and embodied impacts of periods of indenture as a present suspended. So Abigail actually came to Australia as a teenager for 2 years of boarding school and then stayed on to study commerce at university. The plan was always to go back to Malaysia after university graduation. That's what her older sisters had done, and that's what her parents expected of her. But as she explained to me, she met a boy, and that drew her to use that 18-month post-study visa to stay on, but really to pursue the relationship rather than to pursue work. When the relationship ended, she considered returning to Malaysia, but she ended up stumbling into a job managing rental properties at a real estate agent. And she also started a new relationship with a new man. So work didn't play a significant role in Abigail's decision to stay in Australia. She wasn't really interested in pursuing real estate for a long-term career, but she didn't want to be forced to leave her boyfriend behind when her current temporary visa expired. So she decided to take the route of asking her employer to sponsor her for a 2-year skilled work visa. The category at the time was 457, although it's not called that now. Her employers agreed to support her sponsorship. Her 2-year visa was granted relatively quickly. On the one hand, she was really pleased, yet at the same time, the reality of her situation started to sink in. At this stage, she's getting more serious with her boyfriend. They'd moved in together. Abigail had adopted a dog. She was beginning to see a future in Australia, at least in the short term. So she was pretty certain that she wanted to now try and get permanent residency, but more for the sake of not having to take into account yet another looming visa expiry date as she thought through her future plans. But in order to obtain PR, she had to stay working at the real estate company as her sponsor for 2 years of indentured time. If she left that job, she would lose the visa and the pathway to permanent residency. So in terms of the time logic of the sequencing of her career, what Abigail really is talking about here in this quote is how the indenture of her present actually suspends her capacity to really figure out as a young graduate what she even wants to do in the future. She doesn't really know what she wants for her career or really how long she wants to stay. And that goal of PR just kind of doesn't represent for her permanent settlement, but actually the ability to kind of take a break, to have time out from working, to consider her next move within the security of a permanent visa situation. So for a lot of migrants like Abigail, who are tied to employers or tied to particular occupational categories to achieve migration outcomes, their careers can remain in these forms of sequential suspension for several years. And the relations of dependence that are created by the indentured present also have embodied and effective consequences for workers in their dealings with their employers, even if they're not explicitly mistreated. And, you know, in some cases in my research, actually they were. So Abigail's really talking about that here. She really feels forced into a sense of commitment and a sense like the company owns her, and that whatever they tell her to do, she has to just do it. Sometimes indenture also requires suspension in place. So for example, some migrants had to remain in a regional area for a specified time period to obtain a regionally sponsored visa. So in this kind of quote from her interview, which I think is really rich, Abigail's thinking through that lived sense of inertia, immobility and stuckness. And she's thinking about it in relation to the high turnover of other mostly young staff at the company. As a migrant under this time regime of transvocation, Abigail can't engage fluidly with different work opportunities across time the way her peers can. Her visa conditions fix and suspend the sequencing of her career, and this makes the everyday tempo of time at work feel heavy and slow. Building on from this, another theme around work was this idea of dark tunnels, and that's actually a phrase from an interview, dark tunnels of intensified daily time. And these are created when particular migration contingencies place migrants' working tempos outside of the standardised 9-to-5 schedules of other young local professional workers. This could include shift work, weekend work, or the juggling of schedules across multiple workplaces. Here, the dark tunnel of intense work time takes the shape of a segregation of the migrant from the kind of standard logics or tempos of daily middle-class life in Australian cities, leaving them in a disrupted synchronic time logic. They become out of sync often with social lives, leisure time and family routines, especially when they're trying to manage these relationships both locally and transnationally. So the example I have here is Seema from India, who is about 26 years old when I first met her. She had an Australian master's degree in accounting, and here in this quote, she's explaining the impact of her lack of agency over the structure of her working week. This was during a period in which there was a condition on her temporary work visa which required her to work a minimum of 30 hours a week for 1 year to be eligible for PR. This wouldn't have been a problem if Seema had been able to find full-time professional work in accountancy, but she couldn't. And so she's here talking about how she's trying to balance the hours imposed by her visa conditions with the very precarious scheduling of the casual work that she's doing in food services. And so her weekly routine has become this intense juggling of over 70 work hours across 2 workplaces. And you can see her, she's describing how that kind of impacts on her everyday routine. One of the consequences of Seema's really intensified work schedule was that she couldn't provide care for her son, who was about 2 at the time. She felt she had no choice but to send him back to India to be temporarily cared for by her parents. This decision meant that despite her frantic work schedule, she found this period of her life to be marked by this intensely heavy slowness and almost a suspended sense of time passing. Both the tempometric rhythms of each day and the chronologic sequencing of events in time altered for Seema. Focusing only on work, her days blurred into one another with this frenzied sense of monotony, and she even forgot her own birthday. So Seema's story illustrates how logics of tempo can involve the simultaneous yet divergent velocities of acceleration and deceleration. Busyness unfolds contemporaneously with monotony, although days are full, weeks are endless. And so in cases like this, time becomes this dark tunnel, not only because of such intensified tempos, but also because, once again, the present has often been suspended for a possible but uncertain future. And in Seema's case, she has become completely desynced from her other roles as a wife and a mother and a friend. Although she was living with her husband, she even described their relationship during this time as like a long distance one. He was also working long shifts. They rarely crossed paths at home, and they communicated mostly through notes and text messages. And of course, proximate motherhood was also suspended. So Seema's story, the last kind of bit of the paper, I'm going to move away from working lives. I'm going to focus a bit more on intimate relationships. And Seema's story really provides a nice connection between the work temporalities and the intimate life temporalities. Effectively, I'm just going to explore here how intimate relationships impact on the timings of mobility, but also how mobility transforms the possibilities of intimate timelines for these young people. And within most of the cultural contexts of my participants, marriage does remain perceived as a very natural part of the life course sequence. certainly as an end goal of youthful endeavours, and in many cases it seems necessary to achieve adulthood. And that sequencing logic that embeds marriage and family formation as an unavoidable milestone in life course temporalities is, of course, particularly unmalleable for young women. For many of the young migrants I spoke with, but particularly young women, time spent in Australia offered what Fran Martin has identified in her work on Chinese international student women as zones of suspension. So liminal spent times that can function to delay marriage, but also, at least temporarily, rescript some of the norms of intimate and gendered behaviours and practices. So most commonly here living in Australia was understood as a suspension of the ordered sequencing of life events towards marriage, thus a stretching out of periods of singlehood and relative autonomy. And it really was the geographical distance from family and from cultural norms that allowed for this decelerations of tempo in the pathway towards that inevitability of married life. And so these are two, really illustrative quotes from two young women, both from China, who were both about 26, 27, and they enjoyed their single lives in Australia, but they both noted that ongoing singlehood in their late 20s really was a rupture from normative sequencing, and that this rupture was made possible by their distance from their families and peers. So their kind of life timings have been desynchronized from those of their immobile relatives and peers, and certainly from the expectations of their parents. And they both kind of, in fact, envision an alternative immobile present, what would have been their reality if they'd stayed in China. So being in Australia simply suspends a pressure to marry at the right time in some way, and a chance to live, as Colleen notes, a different tempo towards settling and a setting of their own pace for intimate lives. And I think this can also, as both Martin and Kamalini Ramdas have noted in their work on transnationally mobile young women, often this also enables different ways to be single and to explore intimate relationships before marriage. And this was talked about quite a lot in interviews in cases where families or culture have specific prohibitions around cohabitation or premarital dating. However, those kind of disruptive time logics also wrought unwanted frictions or delays to the sequencing of intimate transitions to adulthood. Men were in fact much more concerned about delays often than women, and they often talked about the difficulty that their migration has created in synchronizing career security, which they understood as a precursor to marriage for men, with appropriate marriage timings. So Hyun Woo, for example, from Korea, was really talking about how, for his girlfriend at the time, those temporal age limits for marriage in Korean society were quite gendered, but also that he'd come to Australia as a student and then did a graduate degree and was yet to have a stable career. So he in turn felt a gendered pressure to have a stable job before he could ask his partner to marry him. A couple of other things that sort of evoke this relationship between intimate timings and migration experiences. Similarly, Percy from China, who was single, felt the pressure of needing a financial and job security before he could think about a romantic relationship. And he actually said he was suspending himself from dating because there's a few women that he was interested in, but he felt like he just wasn't ready because he had to sort out his immigration stuff and his career stuff first. And he actually adjourned his romantic interest to some kind of indefinite future time. And I guess a final point here, for young migrants like this, settling down in terms of committed intimate relationships also often becomes symbolically synchronized, not just with a sense of settling into adult life, but also with settlement in terms of a sense of reaching secure belonging as a migrant. So Percy really talks about how, Australia is only going to become his second home when he has a relationship and a family, even though he'd been living there for quite a while. And similarly, Anastasia, a young woman from Taiwan, she already had legal security and had PR, but she said her future still felt really uncertain and settling was still really elusive for her. And part of this was because her relationship with her boyfriend was a little bit rocky at the time. And so that became more significant to her sense of being settled than her legal status. So settling then, this kind of idea of a temporal stabilization of flexible and mobile lives, it does sort of represent an endpoint in multiple ways. ways. The establishment of a committed relationship, the arrival of adulthood, but also potentially a transition to establish belonging in place. And often intimate lives, migration goals, and that passaging to adulthood have to be quite reflexively synchronized with each other in ways that can be quite challenging. So I am running out of time, so I might skip over the policy info here. Basically, for the next slide, all you need to know is that Australian permanent residents and citizens can sponsor spouses and de facto partners in applications for residency in Australia under the family migration stream. Okay, so based on that policy, intimate relationships have, in the Australian context, much more than symbolic intertwinements with the tempos and sequences of settlement. In fact, because of these policies, the capacity for mobility or immobility, arriving, staying, leaving, returning, actually becomes legally embedded into intimate relationships. And this was a reality faced by over half of my sample when one partner had potential to sponsor the other for a visa. So in cases where partner sponsorship was on the table, intimate timelines and timings have to be synchronized with requirements of migration governance, as well as migrants' own plans and desires and familial expectations. And that securing of a migration future becomes relational in terms of both legal and symbolic dependence on the future continuation of a relationship. And one of the things that was most interesting about this was that it kind of meant that, youthful romantic encounters often weren't able to be placed entirely in the present. This living within the time regime of transvocation kind of meant dating had a different temporal vibe to it, I suppose. So Colleen, for example, who was single and dating, not in a relationship, here she's talking about even with dating, temporary visa statuses complicate and kind of restrict the formation of relationships as stuff around commitment gets entangled with migration uncertainty. And so one final example of this before I finish, and this was from a woman whose partner did sponsor her to stay in Australia. I won't give you too much context there because I'm running out of time, but they were a young couple, they hadn't been together for that long, but her visa was running out. And so their romance just couldn't continue to unfold at this uncontrolled pace. Decisions about how serious they were couldn't be deferred if they didn't want to become long distance. For Camilla to stay in the country, they really had to make a decision. And so the paper border of her visa expiry brought the discussion of their future as a couple really abruptly into the present, and the tempo of their commitment kind of had to be accelerated as they discussed the possibility of applying for a partner visa. Camilla really did want to continue the relationship, but as she said, she was only 24, she was uncomfortable about what this kind of intimate acceleration of visa sponsorship might symbolise, a commitment to a future that she wasn't really sure she was ready for. And so migration governance started pulling all these multiple possible futures of staying together, of breaking up, of is there someone else out there for me, into her present. So while in the last section, I talked about how mobility is often a means to obtain freedom and autonomy over intimate timing and timelines, like delaying marriage, such affordances to stretch and suspend intimate timelines actually still exist in this paradoxical relationship to the fact that transvocation and the governance of migrants' relationships can also sort of force them often into forms of acceleration, or even being sustained potentially beyond their natural endpoint. So as Colleen said in the last slide, permanent residency for these young people, it's not just a passport to migration security, but it's also a passport to the capacity to form and sustain equal and committed relationships, not just intimate ones, but also with their employers, and to kind of begin and end one's relationships in terms of work, but also emotional relationships on their own timelines and desires without that influence of visa dependence. So I have run out of time to sum up, but I think hopefully my main points are quite clear. And on the last slide, building on from this project, I'm now working on a fantastic and much larger scale project with my very beloved colleagues, Anita Harris and Loretta Baldassar, which is looking at a very large sample of young people moving both into and out of Australia. So that's the next stage of this work. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to a discussion with all of you.
Thank you so much, Shanti. And I have put in the chat both the discount code for your book, but also the link to the Staggered Pathways site so that people can look at the visual maps that you have created on your website as well. Actually, I'm very impressed by your website, which shows just how talented you are in actually communicating these ideas. I also felt that while reading your book, I particularly appreciated that you foregrounded personal stories from young people. from your participants, which are very evocative and rich and able to communicate very clearly to your readership the sometimes very complex ideas that you're dealing with. But it may have influenced these sort of foregrounding of personal stories may have shaped also how I responded to the book. So rather than, curiously, rather than having my academic head on while reading the book, which is what I anticipated, I also had my personal hat on, because I too am a migrant. But the stories that I was being confronted with were so very different from my stories. And it was just a constant reminder of my level of privilege, of my experience of migration and how I had never thought of time at all, partly because I had never been forced to by an immigration regime. So I am a migrant within the European citizenship framework, moving from the Republic of Ireland to the UK at a time when this was very free and easy. So there were different rules that applied, but also there's a special relationship between Ireland and Britain. So not only are there cultural similarities, but the passing between one context and the other is entirely smooth. There is very little, there's no paperwork. I don't have to apply for permanent residence. I almost have had zero engagement with the Home Office and the immigration regime. So the kind of suspensions of times or the financial outlay that's required has not been something that I've had to deal with. So it's not just I'm mentioning this not just because to assert my wonderful privilege, but also because I was thinking about how these ideas apply in different contexts, like the European Union, where citizenship, EU citizenship used to provide, up until very, very recently, far more ease of flow and mobilities, and how that would have shaped time is quite, I think, would be quite different. Whereas, of course, Asian migrants come into the EU would, of course, face many of the same problems. Or I actually know personally somebody who came from Russia and was actually indentured by her company who stopped paying her. So there are different layers of that, but also different immigration regimes is what it made me think of your book very, very evocatively in that way. And also about the intimate relationship aspect that you really bring to the fore as well through your book. Was interesting, partly because it reminded me of the way the EU promotes their student mobility programs. So part of what they say is, oh, you'll learn skills, you'll be more employable, and you'll also have the great possibility to make friends and develop romance. Here's a case study of a romance. Yeah, I know. I get a great laugh out of this when I teach about it every year, because it's always a bit like, hey, the EU is trying to get you skills, but also they think that presenting themselves as a dating opportunity. But more pertinent, I think, for your work is probably, it reminded me very much of it. It's different but similar. Jen Silva's work on working class youth transitions to adulthood in the United States. And there she talks about, and very often race is forefront in their stories because working class youth are very often not white, but how young men and young women talked about gendered roles and how gendered norms were still so strong, but also how they felt they both financially and emotionally couldn't risk having a relationship with people. So technically they were full citizens, but because of their financially precarious situation, of course, they were not able to have the full citizenship rights that we privileged people do, who have permanent incomes or who can, have permanent housing. So they very much felt, and that's what I was reminded of when you were talking about the intimate relationships that your young people were talking about, how they were postponing. So it's almost like, we could relate this back to the citizenship literature or to class literature or people who are excluded in that way. That's enough muddled thinking from me, I think. I'm now going to pass over to the audience and to the questions that they might have for you, and let them take over. Okay.
So a question's going to come in through the chat, Avril.
Ideally, yes, but also people can raise their hands. It is relatively early, so people might be feeling a little shy.
That's okay. I might just stop my screen share and then I can make the chat nice and big.
Mm-hmm. While we're waiting for some questions coming in, I do have a question for you. And again, probably influenced a little bit by my personal experience, personal thoughts, but also about the work that you're talking about. Because you're talking about suspended time. At what point do you think it's possible for these people, for immigrants, to become settled and to get out of that zone of suspension? And I'm not just talking about, oh, once you get your paperwork, your PR, you're automatically feel that you're there, but rather that when is your identity, or how do we know if we reach an end point, or what, how do we think through that end of things?
Yeah, that is such a good question. I mean, I think I would say that actually, you know, suspension is not a kind of, it's not a totalizing experience for these migrants, that actually time, the temporalities of settling, and I mean, I think settling is probably a better term than settlement, because it does imply that it's an ongoing process and not necessarily a process with a fixed endpoint. I think people experience these processes and often quite active processes of settling, even when they are in visa suspension or even when they are in these periods of indenture. So I think the kind of liminality of suspension exists at the same time as people make lives and embed themselves and build networks. So those things happen simultaneously, I think. What I'm sort of really interested in is how do those governance structures and those visa expiry dates and the staggered nature of migration, how does that mean people maybe have to construct and negotiate and understand their process of settling in a different way? And, you know, certainly the sort of end goal of PR and citizenship throughout my work, you know, even in my earlier book, for a lot of young people coming to Australia, often what Australian citizenship represents is not is yes, the chance to settle down and to call Australia home, but also the opportunity for free mobility and to be able to go back and forth and to know, okay, I can go maybe back to my country of origin and spend some time there. I can move on to a third country if I get a job opportunity, but now I've got the security that I can always come back. So options, I think, and fluidity, as many of you working on youth mobility will know, are often quite a big priority for this demographic. And maybe just to kind of reflect a little bit on your earlier thoughts, I do like the personal reflections, because my favourite thing about this research is every time I present it, there'll be at least one person in the audience that knows exactly what I'm talking about because they've been through it. They've been on a partner visa, or they've come on a student visa, or they've had one of these jobs. And so lots of people have very personal connections to this work. And I think that's why I felt it was really important in the book, although I wanted to write something conceptual, to really foreground the empirical narratives and to keep them quite complete as well and not fragment them too much. And that's one of the functions of the time map methodology. Well, I mean, one of the things that we do as qualitative researchers is we get people's narratives and we chop them up into little bits when we thematize and code them. And with the time maps, I wanted to be able to keep a bit of a sense of being able to see sort of continuity and people's different stages and steps and evolution over time as well. Oh, there's a message.
Mm-hmm. So there's two here. There's a question here from Caitlin Nunn. Can you thank you so much for your engaging presentation. Can you tell us a bit more about the time maps methodology?
Hi, Caitlin. So Caitlin's in Melbourne, but I don't think we've seen each other for probably 2 years because of COVID. So hi. Yeah, so at the beginning of this project, I was really interested in how do I kind of integrate the temporal into my methodology? And I think I sort of answered this question already in the sense that because these pathways are so complicated, I was wary of having them just constantly chopped up and fragmented as I analysed the data. I've also always been really interested in how we can use forms of self-documentation to conduct ethnography with mobile populations and get them to really document and collect or create visual artifacts or observational moments that are significant to them in their journey. So I just asked people in the interview send me things that are important to you and that represent particular milestones or that represent significant things for you in this migration journey. And the interesting thing about staggered migration is it creates so much material collateral. Like if you have to apply for a partner visa, you need to save every email, you need to save every photo, you need to have all your financial stuff in order. And again, this is a generation of young people also quite into documenting their lives anyway via social media. So people actually had tons of stuff and they sent me all of this stuff and I sorted through it and talked through it with them in their second interview and figured out where different pictures and visual artifacts and bits of material kind of weaved into their narration of their journeys. And you can see little bits and pieces of that in the time maps on the website as sort of almost visual exhibits, I guess, of their journeys. And they're always partial, you know, they're not complete, the time maps. There's certainly some things that for various reasons are not in there, but they're just visual representations of some of that stuff.
You wonder after you submit all of this paperwork, what does happen to it? So a friend of mine applied for permanent residency here, and there were boxes and boxes and boxes of bank statements that she had to send. I mean, there's no way anybody checks all of those. So it's a very bizarre sort of documentation paper trail that will be left somewhere.
I remember really distinctly the folders from one participant when I went to do an interview in her house and they'd done the partner visa, and she just had these folders stacked like this high with all of these printouts of bank statements and leases and text messages and emails and birthday cards and just everything you could think of. This whole kind of collateral of an intimate life that they had to save and then present actually to the immigration regime and lay it all bare and lay all that intimate information out in order to prove the legitimacy of their relationship. So that always stayed with me actually from fieldwork.
And the lack of privacy that's involved in that as well. Sorry, Caitlin, just totally taking over.
That's okay. I was just going to jump in because I mean, I guess I'm thinking about all the things, but I'm thinking about all the absences and the silences as well. All the things that people don't have with them on these journeys. And I think thinking about my personal experience at the moment, also the kind of gaps in self in this precarious status. So I'm thinking about it a lot at the moment because of the current political situation, and I want to speak out about things like Palestine and about the new migration policy that's coming in the UK. But I'm terrified for my own visa status, and I'm scared to speak out because I don't trust the Home Office, because we've seen the way that, you know, that they've responded to other migrants. So I guess I'm interested also in perhaps if you have any reflections on the absences and the silences in the stories that you've put together.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good question, Caitlin. And it probably didn't come as through as much in this project, which was a bit more focused on things like the domestic and the intimate, but certainly in my earlier work on international students and certainly in the new work we're doing in the Youth Mobilities project, we're really, really interested in what happens to civic life and what happens to political identity. And I think for the kind of migrants I talked about today, you're right, that probably is the biggest gap and the biggest absence, is the capacity when you're on these long temporary visa journeys to be a fully actualised political subject. You pay tax, but you don't have the right to vote, you don't have access to formal political representation, and your concerns are absolutely reflected in my data. You know, a lot of participants said, I wanted to go and march in that march, or I wanted to be more vocal on Facebook about particular political issues, but I am really, really paranoid that, you know, the immigration minister would cancel my visa or that I'm going to get myself into some kind of trouble. I think what's probably quite troubling that we're seeing now is that even Australian permanent residency and citizenship doesn't provide that sense of political security. I think when I started researching mobile young people in the mid-2000s, they really felt, oh, well, once I've got citizenship, nobody can take that away and then I can have a political voice. I think now people are even wary after that. There is such a sense now, I think in the UK as well as in Australia, that even citizenship is contingent and a fragile thing.
Thank you. Yeah, that's something I've seen in my refugee background research collaborators as well. I think that ongoing sense of precarity, even once you have permanent status, is such a common feature of the contemporary citizenship environment. Thanks.
Yeah, and I will just say, and I mean, a lot of other people are writing on this too, you know, these long periods of immigration precarity, they bleed into your life even once you are quote unquote secure. Like often that's time that you just don't get back. And some of the older participants in this study have just said, I've basically lost 10 years of my life and I can't really get those years back. So even now, though I've ticked the boxes and I've achieved what I wanted to achieve, how do I actually reconcile in my present what that period of time did to my life and how that's going to echo in an ongoing way in my decisions going forward? So that's quite significant too, like the after. Precarity, again, as Avril indicated as well, how does immigration precarity actually interweave itself with other forms of precarity?
I have a question here from Valentina Muzzicato, who may have had to leave to go and teach, but she wanted to ask you about, she's conducting a similar project to your YMAP project, and she was wondering how social media and information technology, what role it plays in young people's temporalities and how the availability kind of shifts, because you have a suspension but also a simultaneity of being here and there.
Yeah, I wish Valentina was still here. I'm a really big fan of her work, and it's influencing a lot of what we're doing with YMAP. I think I can't really fully answer that question maybe until we've got a little bit more of our data analysis finished for the YMAP project. But I think in general, for young people who are on the move, at one level, I would say prior to the pandemic, most of them had quite a seamless sense of not having a separate virtual life and a physical life, like a sense that in a daily sense, the transnational and the local were really interwoven. So you would get up and you check your WhatsApp or your WeChat and you chat with your friends at home, you take a photo of what you were doing and you jump on the train and you speak to your mum, you get to work and engage with your local friends. And these daily kinds of rhythms through social media would be quite embedded. But I do think, and I've got a fantastic PhD student who's in the audience, Hao, and when she's completed her project, we'll have some really interesting perspectives on this stuff through her work too. I think what the pandemic has really done, at least for some of those mobilities in and out of Australia, it's really brought forward the, I guess, inequality around place, and it's made place, I think, more solid. Because say, for example, young working holiday makers from the UK who stayed in Australia, what they saw in social media was actually how much suffering there was in the UK due to COVID compared to in Australia. And I certainly know some young people who were stuck in the UK who said, I cannot look at Instagram and Facebook of people in Australia anymore because, they're all out in the pub in the sunshine, having a pint and enjoying their life. And I actually have to completely disconnect from that because it's almost so far removed from the reality in the UK that it becomes not natural and not embedded, but almost traumatic in a way. So I think there's a couple of different layers there, and that the pandemic has really shifted some of the ways people integrate social media into their daily lives. But this is all a little bit speculative. Yeah, I need to get a bit more data on it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess what we'll also have to do is to consider how these experiences of young people will shape for migrants, for example. You always think, well, I can just hop on a plane, or if push comes to shove, oh, you can't do that anymore. And how this changes relationships, and has it made them in some cases stronger because you're actively trying to foster those relationships more through social media, through FaceTime with grandparents and all those sorts of things. But also how it changes your relationship with, for example, your peers. So the bit where I get to be very jealous of people who have family within the same country and who were able to see those sorts of things, change those sorts of relationships to place.
Absolutely. I mean, the general sort of backup plan of, well, I can always go home if things don't work out. Or, if I have to go home, I can always maybe come back in the future. Now that's all really up in the air, basically. We're looking at least another year of border closures down here. So yeah, absolutely. I think, I've talked about these ideas of suspension, and in a way what the pandemic has done is a suspended mobility for nearly all of us in some way, not just people on temporary visas.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here from Yu Pang. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's very interesting. There are lots of people who move to Australia every year with WHV. I presume that's a visa category. and some stay for years while some only stay for 1 year. What do you think of this phenomenon? Are there commonalities among the people who choose and stay and those who decide to leave?
That's a great question, thank you. So that's a working holiday visa, and absolutely many young people, particularly from Asia, were really increasingly starting to use these visas to spend a period of time in Australia. I would say it just varies quite a lot. I think many young people on working holiday visas really do come just thinking, well, I'm just going to try it and see how it goes, or I'm just going to come for a year, I'm just going to come for 2 years. And then of course life kind of has other plans, and maybe they do meet someone and form a relationship, or maybe they do find the lifestyle really appealing, or maybe in the first year of their working holiday visa they don't actually achieve the things that they were planning or hoping to achieve. Quite a lot of people, for example, say, I came to Australia, I started working, Sydney was so much more expensive than I thought. I kind of blinked and the next thing I knew my visa was nearly up, and I hadn't travelled and I hadn't done all of these fun leisure things that I thought I was going to do. So that's why I wanted to try and stay for a second year and then for a third year and so on. So I think there's a lot of, there's a bit of planning, but I think mostly there's an unplannability and an unmappability around a lot of these youth mobilities, where people have to make a few decisions on the fly, and often end up staying when they weren't planning to stay, or leaving when they weren't planning to leave. And obviously there are hierarchies of privilege in who actually can stay. So it's not possible for everybody who enters on one of these visas to find a pathway to stay. So some of that can be very dependent on all kinds of governance criteria, but also on sort of serendipity. You know, Abigail, for example, she was just quite lucky that she got into a job where they were able to sponsor her. So it's very dependent both on the governance limitations on being able to stay, but also I guess on people's individual plans and desires and how they unfold. Also, I'd kind of say that for countries like Korea specifically, which is really heavily marketed working holiday programs, I think there's a point at which many young people realise that they're not going to have as big a payoff back in their home country labour market as they perhaps anticipated. I think often these youth mobility experiences are sold as, you're going to learn English, you're going to come back with all of these global skills and be really employable. I think some of them start seeing that that's not actually the case for their peers that go back, and that can also be something that motivates them to stay. I'd really recommend Carolyn Choi's work on the educational mobilities of young people from South Korea, which really shows that segmentation in the different pathways and the promise of the global career and how that actually plays out for different young people.
Thank you very much, Shanti. We are coming up to the end of the hour, so I want to just say thank you again for taking the time to talk to us. We're going to let you go have your dinner now. Hope we go and have our first coffees. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you today. There are quite a few people in the chat saying thank you very much, and I'll send you a copy of the chat so that you, if there's any questions that you want to get back to, or any questions that will be thought-provoking for you. Okay, thank you very much also to everybody who joined us today. This is
Thank you so much for having me. It was
This is the third session. We'll be reconvening again next Tuesday at 12 noon, where we'll be talking about mobilities within the UK, both internal mobility and external mobility. Hope to see lots of you there then again. One final thank you to Shanti. Great to see you.